Hello and welcome to a video where we'll be looking at the difference between closures, promises, async await, and function generators. So getting right into it, we need to understand the difference between asynchronous programming and synchronous programming. So just to make it really easy, asynchronous is anything that doesn't run in the main application thread, and synchronous does. Synchronous programming would be something like the following, where we define some kind of number where it would be equal to 5, and then we might increase that number by 1, and then we could log it as so. And here we log it. And we get the value 6. And this is synchronous because each line is done one after another until we get the result we wish. Asynchronous would be using some kind of asynchronous method. In this case, we could use setTimeout as an example, where the first parameter is an anonymous function, and the second parameter is the time, which is in milliseconds. And for example, in 1000 milliseconds, this anonymous function will be called, and in here we could do .log value 5. As you can see, we get the value 5 after 1 second. If we decide to do hello, and then we do log world, obviously world is going to be first because it's synchronous, and this one, since it's asynchronous, is going to be called second because it's only called after 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. So now we don't understand the difference, we can actually look into as to why closures or callbacks were created. So closures and callbacks, they're pretty much the same thing. Closure is just a fancy word to say something that will end the function, will close the function off. So for example, we could do some fetch request that will take in a callback. So this is how things were done when JavaScript was first created, like the original way of doing things. And that would be inside of here, before we actually did our request, we would write prepare a request with the new XML HTTP request, like so. And then we would write if this.readyState. Before I actually do that, I need to do, and then what we need to do is request.onReadyState.change. So when the state actually changed of the request, we check to see if the ready state is actually equal to XML HTTP request .done. And if that was good, then we would do this.status equals 200 to see if the request actually worked. And if it worked, then, well, we have our response, which would be somewhere here, this.response text, but we couldn't actually just simply do return because we're actually in a callback function. Yes, of course you could do the XML HTTP request synchronously, but that isn't really good because it blocks your whole application, right? And some network requests, you don't know how long it could take to do. So we actually put it in some kind of asynchronous function, but this doesn't really work because we actually return it to this, and that doesn't really make sense. Well, it doesn't actually return, it returns to nothing. So the question is, how do we actually send this data back to out of this function? Because we can't simply just do, for example, the data from the fetch equals some kind of fetch request, and then we couldn't just simply do that. So that's the reason why we have this callback. So callback is simply anonymous function that would be called with the data. So we set it to like nothing. Then we have like the results, which could be the data, and we do data equals results. At this moment, we've actually set it like that. And to call it, we have the callback, which is this anonymous function again here. We simply do callback when the response worked, when the request succeeded. But as you can see, this is already getting not really pretty. We have some conditions within conditions, and you know, who doesn't say that we could have some other kind of callback inside? For like, we could have a set time inside, which is like another callback, and we could have like another, and all of a sudden we have like these callbacks within callbacks within callbacks, and this is not really pretty. So what I'm getting to is the whole point of creating, for example, promises was to solve this previous problem where we had, where we could have callbacks within callbacks. Now, a promise is simply function some promise func. A promise is simply something that returns a promise. So we would create the new promise, which actually takes into parameter a callback, and we will put resolve and reject. Now, this is really nice because here what we could do is we could do, like, for example, some asynchronous method with a kind of callback inside, and after 1,000 seconds we could simply do resolve our data. I'm just making some fake data, okay? And then all we would have to do to use it afterwards, this is where it comes nice and handy, is we just simply use .then. And here is the data that gets sent back into the resolve function. So when whatever you decide to do succeeded, you would send the data, you would call the resolve function, which is simply like a callback to, and pass the data you wish to send back. And then you could just log it, for example. And here we would see data in the console log. And if there was an error, you would reject it. You would send reject. And reject would be caught simply by the catch method, where we have the error and we could log it. In this case, it would be the string data, like this. But most errors are just simply an object with a message, and we write some message error occurred. And here we do error.message. And we get this, some message error occurred. So all this is really nice, and we can actually see how it works with our fetch request. Fetch, like any fetch today in JavaScript, actually returns a promise. So we do our fetch request, we call the API or the URL, whatever, and it returns a result. And we can actually see what that result is. We could just log it, for example. We can log it, and we can see here, there's a response, and it has some stuff inside of it. And unfortunately, I can't see exactly what's inside of it here, but I do know that if this is an API that returns some JSON, and it is an API that returns some JSON, well, the response will have the .json method to actually transform the body into some JSON. Now, .json also returns a promise. So that means that I can also do .then and have the data available and simply console.log it. Now this is where the advantage is over callbacks within callbacks within callbacks, is that it looks like it's line after line after line. And you don't have like this, function within function within function, which becomes really unreadable after a while. So here I can run it, and I have my data here, status, success, message, and then I have an image of a nice little dog. So this is how promises work. Once we understand this part, I'm going to put this into just comments real quick. We can start understanding what async and await is. Async and await is just, in my opinion, it's just a shorthand for promises. Because in async, some async func returns a promise, right? It returns a promise. What did I do wrong? Function. Right, it returns a promise. So if I log some async func, if I type it right, maybe we can get it. Some async func like this. Just log it simply. It's probably going to tell me that it's a promise. And apparently it was resolved. Of course, there was nothing returned or anything, so in its opinion, it was resolved. So here, for it to work like a promise, let's do our network request, right? Let's do like response equals the fetch of the API URL, which again returns a promise. So if it returns a promise, in front we can write await, and so we await for the result. And if it returns a promise, then we'll get the response here instead of having to write .then and then getting the promise. So the moment we get the promise, well, we also want now to get the data from that response, and the data is in the response.json, which also returns a promise. So we have to write the word await in front. It's asynchronous. A promise is asynchronous. So anything asynchronous, you can write the word await in front. So at this moment, we have the data that we want, and we can just simply return the data. And here, since we know an async method returns response, and if we're not in an asynchronous function, and like for example, if we're in the global scope of the in JavaScript, if we're in the global scope in Node or JavaScript, it doesn't matter. Well, we're not in an asynchronous environment, so we actually have to revert to the .then and have the data, and then we can just console.log the data, right? For example, and here it should work exactly the same. Boom, we have our image of the dog that we wanted to get back. So this is async await. And once you've understood that when you have something with a sync keyword in front, you can actually use await, then it's all good. And asynchronous always returns a promise. Well, a promise. .then, and we can get the data that was returned here. That's all there is to it. So we've understood async await, and now let's look at generator functions. So the question is, we already, like, maybe some of you know what a generator function is. They're not, I wouldn't say they are used too often, just how they are, but they can be used for fetches. Here I could just simply write a generator function. I'm going to call it gen, and it has to have that special star keyword somewhere. I have to remember, I think it's here. Yeah, I think it's there. So I have my generator function, and inside I could write yield, that's a keyword 1. And then if I create my iterator, a generator function actually creates an iterator, and I can do console.log iterator.next to retrieve the value. And what yield does is yield actually returns the value that's after it. So 1 would be the value. So if I did iterator.next, it would stop at yield, and it would return 1. And here we can look in the console, and we should see the value 1. Well, an iterator actually returns an object where the value is 1. So I'd have to write the value here afterwards to actually get the 1. So here, and then we could have multiple yields. We could have like yield 1, yield 2, yield 3, and for each next value, it's always going to turn the next yield value that is awaited. And I could write this 3 times in a row, for example. And it would return 1, 2, 3, because the next is going to call the first yield available. It's going to go into the function. When it arrives to a yield, it's going to return that value, and it's going to save that position. Then when we come back and do the next, it's going to continue starting off where it left off, and it's going to continue. It's going to return 2, and so on and so forth. And if we continue more, we'll see that the value will be undefined, but then it also has the object, as we saw previously here, it has a done. If the value is undefined, it returns done true, and we know that there's nothing left to get from this function, from this generator function. So this is actually interesting. So the question is, how can we use this to our advantage to create maybe some kind of fetch requests in the same manner as we did here with async await? Well, it's totally possible because there are projects that exist for this. For example, I believe it's called, I think it's called Flow, and I think this one is called Co. Can actually maybe look it up real quick. Co.js. Yeah, it's called the Co. And the idea is you wrap with the Co function. You use a generator function callback, and you kind of use it the same way as you would with async await. And the question is, how do they do this? You know, without using a library, could we implement this ourselves? And the answer is absolutely. And it's actually not that complicated. So if we wanted to create flow or co in some general same manner, then what we would have to do is the following. I'm going to delete all this. I'm going to call it generator/yield. And do this, we'd have to create, for example, we're going to name it flow, and it's going to take in some kind of generator function, right? I'm going to call it I'm going to call it gen. And inside the flow, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get the iterator again, the iterator. I'm going to call it iterator. I'm going to call it get the iterator here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do return. We're going to call it, we create some kind of anonymous asynchronous. This is really important. A synchronous function. It's going to auto call itself. This will auto call it. And inside, what we need to do is we need to define a few objects. So let obj and the result that's going to be returned is going to be equal to iterator.next. Now, while obj.done is equal to false, so remember, it returns, the object actually returns undefined. While it's equal to false, what we'll be doing is we're going to keep on, well, the first thing we need to do is check if the obj.value is actually equal to, is an instance of promise. Because remember, if we think of this thing as like a generator, we would have to write like yield here. And so yield always returns the value that's afterwards, and this would return a promise. This would return a promise. So we actually want to handle the promises. Yes. So if it's actually equal to a promise, because a yield doesn't actually like unwrap a promise and get the value, we actually have to do that ourselves in this asynchronous function. So to actually get it to work like async await, we actually have to wrap it in some kind of asynchronous functions, which is actually exactly what we're doing here. So at this point, we'd have to be like, we're going to re-update the value. I'm going to say await obj.value. And at that moment, what we're going to do is we're going to save. We're going to save that updated object into res. Why? Well, simply because remember, we're going to keep looping until the value is undefined. Well, if obj is now undefined, well, we kind of just lost the results, or the value that we actually want to return. So here I write obj iterator.next obj.value. And the whole point of passing obj.value here is, for example, let's pretend this is some kind of a generator function, and we write yield here and yield here. Well, we get the response, we get the promise from the fetch, and there's a yield. So we leave it, And then we'd be in our flow function, we write .next, and we come back in and we pick up here, right? And then we attempt to do response.json. Well, it never actually gave the value returned here and put it in a response. So this is undefined and we get an error. So to actually update response with its actual value, excuse me, with its actual value, then we need to pass that value in the next, and it will simply update the response, and we could here then do response.json. So this is exactly what we're doing here. And at the very end, what we do is we do return res.value, right? And so let's try it out. So we created our flow with the generator, and so we're going to simply do results equals, and we can see if that works. It should return a promise, so that's interesting. So we could do flow, pass our generator function in here. And what do we want to do? We want to get the, we don't want response, we don't want to do fetch of the API URL, and then we want to get the data by doing a response.json, and then we just want to return the data. Let's just see how this works. Of course, we have to use the keyword yield, just like if it was a wait. And let's see if we can actually get the data, and by just doing a result.then data console.log data. I think I've seen everything. Thanks for watching the video. Like, comment, subscribe if you wish. If you want me to talk about anything in specific or talk about any other subject, just leave a comment. And thank you again for watching.